G'day and welcome back. Now, I'm going to have a bit of a rant today. That's unusual, isn't it? But I want to talk about the drone thing, of course, again. And we're being told that if you want to fly drones, don't fly them in built-up areas, don't fly them near people, don't fly them near property, and certainly don't fly them near airports. That's all common sense, that's all pretty good stuff, but there are still idiots out there who do not listen to this and fly in those areas, and they cause problems. But what about the people who do follow the recommendations, the people who do stay well away from airports and buildings and people and property? What about them? Where do they fly? Well, they fly in the countryside, don't they? They fly as far away from other people and risks as they can. So you would think these people are safe, and they fly under 400 feet, again, following the regulations. So you'd think these people are safe. You think these are the last people likely to cause issues and to be involved in an incident between a drone and a manned aircraft. But I've just been reading a CAA safety investigation report. This is CAA occurrence number, 16/6701. I'm going to put a link to this document in the description of this video because I think you probably want to read it, because it speaks to I try not to be harsh on regulators. I realise that regulators have a very difficult job. They've got to try and balance up the needs of the manned aviation community, the pressure applied by politicians and commercial interests, and also us pesky hobbyists. So they have to try and find they're doing a balancing act. But I think they've got it wrong. And I'm going to show you why I think they've got it wrong with some evidence here today. Now, this safety incident report is in relation to a Pacific Aerospace 750XL with the registration ZK. If you're in America, it's ZK JPU, Juliet Papa Uniform. Now, this aircraft crashed. Unfortunately, very sadly, there was a loss of 2 lives. And so any time there is an aviation incident that involves loss of life, it is tragic. I mean, let's face it, it's a very unfortunate, very tragic thing. But hopefully in each of these cases, we learn something. And the information that we learn can be used to save other lives. And that's generally why they do these reports. They analyse what went wrong. They look at how this problem can be avoided in the future. And just to give you an overview, this aircraft, which was configured as a top dressing aircraft. Now, these are made in New Zealand, these aircraft. I think I've got some footage I'll put up here that I've taken, one that was operating at the airfield here in Tokoroa, but it wasn't set up for top dressing. Now, but they can be set up for top dressing. They can carry a huge load. They're a turboprop craft, very similar to the FU-24, which is a smaller version of this thing. And they're designed for agricultural use, for harsh environments, for carrying heavy loads and, taking a fair bit of abuse. So they're a pretty reliable, robust aircraft. There's nothing wrong with the aircraft. Now, this aircraft was flying to a job. And again, I've got to say, this is like, in America, this is crop dusting, right? This is applying fertilizer to farm pasture, quite often on hilly country, because it's more cost effective to use an aircraft when the contour is steep than to use a ground-based application. So this aircraft was flying to an area where top dressing was to be applied, where crop dusting was to be done. But it wasn't actually engaged in that work at the time. It was en route from where it was to a job across country. So unfortunately, it hit some power lines. Some of the national grid, the huge high tension power lines that run across the length of this nation, providing power to all different towns and cities and places along the way. So unfortunately, it collided with power lines, and both people in the aircraft, that was the pilot and the loader operator, died in the subsequent impact, unsurvivable impact. So what do we learn from this? Well, the CAA report goes on and it says some interesting stuff. The report identifies the following, as they say, contributory factors to this crash. They say a number of human factors influence the pilot's decision-making to deviate from the original flight plan. The pilot had not conducted a hazard briefing for the area to be flown at low level. As a consequence, the pilot did not have the most accurate and well-informed mental model of the environment and hazards. Now, if you've been watching my RC Model Reviews channel, you notice that I've talked about this mental model, this model of the world you build inside your head. It's called situational awareness. They make mention of that here. And then they say, due to the limitations of an individual's attentional resource, it is likely the pilot experienced unintentional, or they call it inattentional blindness, due to their attention being engaged on the other aircraft, leading the pilot to strike the high voltage power lines. Now, there were 2 aircraft operating in the area. One was actually doing some application of fertiliser, and this one was coming to join him, right? So that's the contributory factors. But there's one contributory factor that's really, really missing here. And let me read another piece just to give you a clue as to what that is. I'm going to tell you about the power lines, the huge high tension power lines the aircraft hit. And it says in section 1.18.2 of this report, the maximum clearance between the ground and the lowest of the 6 conductors, approximately mid-span, was approximately 200 feet, that's 61 metres. And the distance between the lowest and highest conductors was 21 feet, or 6.4 metres. So this was 200 feet above the ground. The impact occurred 200 feet above the ground. Remember that. This guy was not conducting agricultural operations. He was en route to the destination where he would be conducting agricultural operations. The report then goes on to say, and this is very, very good, it goes on to say, the conductors supporting structures are not required to be physically marked in accordance with CAR 77, as the span supporting the structures is lower than 120 metres above ground level. Lower than 120 metres. That number, 120 metres, is important because that's the maximum altitude you're allowed to fly a drone or model aircraft in this country. So this entire structure was below the maximum altitude you're allowed to fly a drone. Think about that for a minute. Now the report also says that in accordance with the CARs, the aviation regulations, as outlined in the operator's standard operating procedures, the flight to this next job was to be undertaken in accordance with the requirements of CAR 91.311, which is the minimum heights for VFR flying. And this is for manned aviation. And that particular regulation states that a pilot must not fly at a height of less than 500 feet above the surface or a height of less than 500 feet above any obstacle, person, vehicle, vessel or structure that is within a horizontal radius of 150 metres from the point immediately below the aircraft. Now, that means that this pilot should have been at least 500 feet. In fact, as he flew over the power lines, he should have been 700 feet because it says you've got to be 500 feet above any obstacle. And we've already been told that the power lines were 200 feet above the ground. So he should have climbed to 500 feet to clear the power lines. Now, he didn't know the power lines were there, and he hit them. And he didn't see them, and he hit them. Which raises my whole point, the thing I've been trying to get through to regulators, is that if you want to improve aviation safety, you need to be really, really clamping down on manned aviation that flies below 500 feet when they're not allowed or not supposed to be. This operator was, according to CAA, in breach of the regulations, in breach of their own company's standard operating procedures. So that was the cause. There was all these other factors, but that was the one cause of this crash, as I read it in this report. If he'd been flying at 400 feet, he would have had 200 feet clearance above those power lines, but he wasn't. He was flying below 500 feet, and he wasn't engaged in an agricultural operation. He was transiting to the next job. So what can we learn from this? Well, we'll go to the summary notes that CAA have put here, the regulator have put summary notes, to basically give other pilots guidance as to how to avoid the situation. And this is where I am very, very much disappointed in our civil aviation regulations. Let's come to, where are we going to find the right piece here? Conclusions. Conclusions. Safety actions, that's what I'm looking for, safety actions. This is what they recommend to avoid other people doing it. It goes on and says that a safety action was raised recommending the operator require the flight following system radius function to be deactivated, this piece of technology on the aircraft, which isn't really relevant. It then says a safety action was also raised recommending the CAA and agricultural aviation industry provide awareness to pilots explaining the purpose of hazard identification, blah, 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 blah. Okay, then it has another one that says another safety action report was raised recommending the operator in collaboration with the agricultural aviation industry implement a team resource management approach. It's all airy-fairy, touchy-feely, it's all, paperwork. And then it says, since the accident, the following safety actions have been implemented. So this is what's actually happened in the wake of this accident to try and prevent it happening again. It says, in order to better support pilots and enabling them to concentrate on the aerial application tasks and the management of associated risks, the operator has hired an operations manager, and his role is to manage the pilot's work schedule, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Then the electricity lines company responsible for the high voltage power lines held some discussions with the electrical industry, contractors, landowners and pilots in the area with regards to what steps could be taken to reduce the risk of wire strikes. And That's it. Well, where is the recommendation to remind pilots that they must always fly above 500 feet? There's nothing there. That was the one primary cause of this entire tragic accident. And CAA has made no recommendations to strengthen or to remind pilots that they must always fly at 500 feet AGL unless actually engaged in one of these agricultural operations. The reason I raise this is because in this case we have power lines. We have massive great power lines 200 feet above the ground. An aircraft hits them. Nobody is blaming the power company. They put these power lines up there. They didn't have flashing lights or beacons or warning indicators of any kind, and an aircraft hit them, 2 people died. It wasn't the power company's fault. Right? Power company was operating quite legally. But now let's change the scene a bit here. Let's imagine that in that position there weren't any power lines, but somebody was flying a drone well away from the city, well away from airports, well away from people and property, out there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the countryside. They were flying a drone at 200 feet above the ground, half the legal maximum altitude. And that plane came along and it hit the drone and the 2 people died. What do you think the outcome would be? The people who had the drone would be completely gutted and vilified, hung out to dry, right? Because they'd caused the crash of this plane. But they were operating completely legally, just like the power company who put the lines up. In fact, there's no recommendation here, for example, to put flashing strobes on the power system or little pennants on the line so that pilots can see them, because the rationale is pilots shouldn't be flying that low in that area. And so it was the pilot's fault. But hang on, if someone was flying a drone there or a model aircraft at 200 feet and an aircraft hit it and people died, would the same attitude be extended to the operators of the drone or the model aircraft? I don't think it would. And this is where I get really annoyed, because the situation is identical. If pilots wish to fly below 500 feet when they're not legally entitled to, then the responsibility for deaths like this is entirely that of the manned aviation community. It's entirely their own fault. If you walk out onto a busy road with your eyes closed, you will get hit by a car. So you don't do that. You don't blame the car driver who you run out in front of. You don't blame him for hitting you. No, you blame yourself for not doing the right thing. That's what I believe has happened in this instance. And CAA have not taken on board the primary cause of this crash, these deaths, as a failure to observe the regulation that says you must remain above 500 feet and 500 feet above any structure or person or object. So what do you think? What do you think as an audience? Does this show that the regulators really have this huge, massive bias against unmanned aviation, against recreational model flyers? Because we would be hung, drawn and quartered if this wasn't power lines, if this was a drone or a model aircraft. The person flying that drone or model aircraft would be in jail. Yet the power company, they're good as gold. We're legally allowed to have our power lines there. It was the pilot's fault for not flying at the right altitude. We cannot use that excuse. Why can we not use that excuse? Remember, if an aircraft is approaching at very low altitude in hilly terrain, you probably wouldn't hear it until it was upon you. So this, you must give way to manned aircraft, you cannot necessarily follow that rationale. And if the aviators, or if the regulators are going to say, well, you shouldn't be flying in the countryside, well, then where the hell do we fly? If we can't fly miles away from airports and cities and cars and people, where the hell can we fly? And are we going to be carrying the responsibility, carrying the guilt and the liability if a manned aviator breaks the rules and kills themselves by hitting a drone or a model aircraft that's being flown legally? I know we will get hammered, but I don't think we should. And it's time to take action and to remind regulators that everyone has a right to use the airspace. I think the time is now. The time is now. In America, they want to force RC model flyers and drone operators to put transponders on their toy models, on their little aircraft, right? And the little drones, the little model aircraft, transponders to make it safe for manned aviation. Well, then why don't these power pylons have transponders to make it safe for manned aviation? Because a number of people, in fact, quite a few people around the world have been killed flying into power lines with manned aircraft. This resulted in quite a number of deaths. No one's ever died from hitting a drone in a manned aircraft. Recreational multi-rotor drones have never killed anyone who's been flying a manned aircraft. Yet we're going to have to put transponders up, despite the zero historical risk. And the power companies, they don't need to do anything, even though their power lines have caused multiple deaths. This is a really important issue, and it speaks to this whole underlying prejudice against the hobby. And as long as this prejudice remains in place, and as long as we don't stand up and say, this is not right, people are dying for the wrong reasons, then if we don't stand up and make the noise now, then we're going to get squashed. We're going to get totally squashed by regulators, by politicians, by legislators, because we didn't say anything. So I think it's time for us to take this on board. I'd like to hear what you've got to say. This is a really, 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 check my notes, really important issue. And we need to speak out now, not later, not once some poor guy flying his drone in the safest way he can possibly imagine, well away from towns, cities, people, well away from airports. Not once he is unfortunate enough to get in the way of a manned aircraft flying below the legal minimum and producing a death. What do you think? I think we need to send a message to the regulators. We need to do it with a concerted voice, and we need to do it now. You tell me what you think, how we should do it. Or if I'm just out of my tree, am I completely offbeat on this one? Remember, there's a link to this report in the description of this video. Go and read the whole report. And then tell me what you think. Should CAA, should the regulator have made it very clear that it's a responsibility in the safety recommendations, a responsibility of manned aircraft to maintain that 500-foot altitude or height above the ground? It's not an altitude, it's a height above the ground. Because when they don't, bad things happen. That's it from me. Sorry to be on such a down note, but this is so important. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks to my Patreon supporters, make this possible. And bye for now.